Welcome back in. As we talked about earlier, prosecutors in the Luigi Mangione case may face an uphill battle amid surging public support for the man accused of cold-blooded murder. Let's bring in career prosecutor and friend of the show, Jim Trusty, to talk about what's happening, maybe strategizing behind closed doors for prosecutors right now. We talked about at the beginning of the show mass social media support for Mangione, including this education about the concept of jury nullification. Do you think this kind of public sympathy and conversation is a barrier for prosecutors?
I think it's a consideration. I'm not sure I'd quite elevate it to the point of viewing it as an absolute barrier. I mean, look, a lot of it's going to come down ultimately to where public sentiment is about this guy by the time you pick a jury, which is a long time off. And so, yes, if you have prospective jurors who have gone online and said outrageous, stupid things about, this is what he had coming, that it's okay for healthcare executives to be gunned down in broad daylight, then they're probably never going to make the cut and get on the jury. You do have to worry about some sleepers, some people that are sympathetic that won't really answer things particularly robustly. But it's the type of case, because of the media attention to it, you'll probably get the benefit of a questionnaire going to prospective jurors. And that's a great tool if you're a prosecutor to try to get as much information in advance of the actual court date as you can. And in a lot of instances, the parties will work together to excuse people that are clearly never going to make it because of their bias, that would be struck, as they say, for cause by a judge. So there's a lot of kind of inherent pressure that's going to eliminate maybe the most strident of fans for Mr. Mangione. But it is certainly going to be something over the long run where the prosecutors have to keep an eye out to whether there's anything in people's backgrounds that comes out during the jury selection process that spooks them, that scares them, that they're going to have some sort of untoward sympathy.
The questionnaire may be the answer here, but the rise of social media has certainly contributed to the consideration of how to try a case and how to pick a jury, perhaps even more so in the last few years. And right now, we're just seeing a lot of social media focus on this case and the sympathy toward him. How do you, as a prosecutor, factor in that not just traditional media conversation, but people peer-to-peer talking about it in their social media circles, and it really swirling everywhere?
Yeah, it's a real challenge because there's a lot of discretion in the judges as to how deep they're going to let you dive with prospective jurors. Some judges are speed merchants where you barely get any information other than the basics. What does this person do for a living? Where do they live? Are they married? Do they have kids? And I've had judges that keep a very tight leash because they want that jury picked by lunchtime on the first day. I've had the other extreme, particularly when you're dealing with like a death penalty case, where you might spend weeks picking a jury and you get to know them pretty well. And then there's differences on whether the judge is doing all the questioning or the attorneys, which if it's the attorneys, it gives you an opportunity to kind of freelance and maybe bond a little bit with prospective jurors. But more and more, you've got to, you may or may not be privy to what any of these people are saying online. You're certainly not privy to what they say at the kitchen counter. So you have to come up with questions that are designed to just get them talking and see, as an active listener, is there anything that's creeping out of the conversation that's a yellow flag or a red flag about putting this person on a jury?
There are videos on social media now getting 20, 30, 40 billion views explaining what jury nullification is. What's your experience with whether or not you can talk about jury nullification? Some people say the first rule of jury nullification is don't talk about jury nullification. But what's your experience as a prosecutor and what judges would allow and what could be said?
Yeah, my experience, again, I've straddled state and federal court. And judges were pretty upset at the notion of overtly seeking jury nullification. So if you, as an attorney, were basically telling the jury, don't worry about the law, this is just wrong, and my guy shouldn't be convicted because he's a patron saint of healthcare, whatever the theory for nullification, a lot of times in this area it would break down on race historically. Most judges instruct against it, and they will hold it against the lawyers for trying to overtly inject it into the case. Now, that said, jurors are educated, jurors are opinionated, and I'm certain that there's been verdicts, even with very strong objections or instructions from the court,
right,
that reflect at least some level of nullification.
I have to ask you quickly at the end here, as we get closer to January 6th and the possibility of a sweeping pardon looms for those defendants who have been convicted. With your experience as a career prosecutor, what do you think that would say if that does happen? And what do you think prosecutors who have spent maybe the bulk of their careers working on these cases are thinking right now?
Well, look, I mean, for January 6th, if it's the bulk of their careers, they're pretty young. They've only been doing it for a few years. But look, it is a strange concept when you put in the sweat equity of prosecuting a case, and then you find out later that the client, or the defendant, was either commuted or pardoned. I've never had a defendant that I prosecuted that got a full pardon. Sometimes I've seen other forms of relief downstream. And frankly, once you get further away from the trial, you tend to get a little bit more balanced in your outlook. So I don't know that it's going to be a devastating moment. But look, these were politically charged prosecutions where prosecutors from around the country volunteered to come to Washington to take part in these prosecutions. So I have a feeling they do feel pretty vested. They will feel fairly crestfallen with some of these cases being pardoned or commuted. But I also am not really sure I know what that process is going to look like. And what I mean by that, Katie, I'll be really quick. I think there could be a line, and I have no inside info here, but there could be a line between people that engaged in actual assault of police officers or vandalism, destruction of property, and people that were just there. And so I'm curious about how big a blanket is going to be thrown on these prosecutions. And I think a lot of people would not be quite as bent out of shape if non-assaultive, non-violent defendants from this case were given some form of relief, either a commutation or a pardon. But we got to wait and see. I mean, if it's a blanket for everybody, that's going to cause some real heartache and headache with prosecutors and perhaps citizens alike.
All right. Well, something to keep an eye on. Jim Trusty, thanks for joining us as always.
Sure. Great to see you.